Hello everyone and welcome to a very exciting game between Magnus Carlsen and Jorden van Foreest. It's from the Aimchess Rapid, which is the fourth event of the $2 million Champions Chess Tour that features three divisions, one of 18, one of 16, and one of 32 players. And what's interesting about this tournament is that it doesn't matter if you lose a match, you just drop down a division, but you can still climb up and actually win the match. Each division consists of a double elimination knockout where, like I said, if you lose, you can bounce back. So that being said, let's check it out. This is the second game of their match. First game was just a brutal grind by Magnus. He won a completely equal knight and pawn endgame over the course of some 82 moves, I believe, and it was just hard to watch. And this is now a second game where Jorden will have a chance to bounce back with the black pieces, as Magnus also defeated him with black in the first round. So let's check it out. We do have quite a bit of theory, some 15 moves, but then we will, of course, reach new territory. So pawn to e4, pawn to e5 by Jorden, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5. So Magnus goes for the Ruy Lopez, knight to f6, the Berlin defense, and now Magnus castles. We have knight captures on e4 and rook to e1. This is the so-called Rio Gambit accepted variation, knight to d6, and knight captures on e5. We have bishop to e7, bishop back to f1, and now, of course, knight captures on e5, rook captures, and now castles. We have pawn to d4 and bishop to f6. Many games in the database with these exact moves. Nothing new being played here. Rook e1, rook to e8, and now bishop to f4. Jorden trades. We have rook captures, queen captures, and now knight to e8. We have pawn to c3, defending the d4 pawn here, and pawn to d5. Jorden wants to have a similar setup here. We have knight to d2 and pawn to c6. And there are some games where bishop to d3 was played, also queen to e3 is a known move, but here we have pawn to a4, and it is now as of move 15 that we have a completely new game. So okay, pawn to a5, of course, stopping b4, this is essential. We have bishop to d3 and now pawn to g6, diminishing the power of the bishop on d3 and also making room for the knight to come to g7 and then to f5, or maybe the bishop will come to f5, all depends on what Magnus plays. So knight to f3, and now knight to g7. We have bishop to h6, and now bishop to e6. It's very interesting what Magnus would do if knight to f5 was played, for example. Probably he would just go back, obviously. Maybe giving up the bishop pair so early, not what you want to do. It is a rapid game after all. But okay, instead bishop to e6 was played, pawn to h3, and now queen to d6, preparing to bring the rook into the game. So queen to d2, of course, Magnus knows that Jorden will develop the rook on the only open file on the board. So rook to e8. We have rook to e1, countering the rook on e8, and now queen to d8. You're nicely protecting your rook, and also if the position opens up with some c4 at some point, okay, maybe the a5 pawn will be defended, so it's a good square for the queen. We have pawn to g4, Magnus grabs more space on the king side, and bishop to c8 now. Jorden just offers a trade of rooks, Magnus obliges, rook captures, knight captures, and now queen to f4, just improving the position of the queen, grabbing more space. Queen to c7, offering a queen trade, and while Magnus doesn't actively trade, he also doesn't mind the trade, so he just improves the position of his king. We have queen captures on f4, bishop captures, and now bishop to e7. We have pawn to g5. Very interesting move and a very committal move by Magnus. Of course, pawns are one of those, the only piece that once it goes forward, it cannot go back unless it becomes something else. Okay, then you can go wherever you want pretty much, but as long as it's a pawn, it can only go forward. And the idea, of course, is advance the h pawn as far as possible. So bishop to d6, offering further trades, and Magnus just improves his position. Knight e5, beautiful centralizing move. King f8, bringing the king closer to the action, and now pawn to h4. We have king to a7, and now even pawn to h5. Now you can see how bishop is doing good work here. If you capture on h5, then bishop will capture on h7, and then you will go after this h5 captured pawn. So knight to g7, attacking h5, kind of asking Magnus to either capture on g6 or advance the pawn, and Magnus advances it. Pawn to h6, we have knight to e6 now attacking the bishop, and bishop to e3, nicely controlling all of the squares that the knight can go to. So knight back to f8, now the knight can be shifted to d7 to challenge the knight on e5, and king to f3, Magnus just improves the position of his king. We have bishop to f5, And now, finally, Magnus trades. With bishop captures, G captures, Jorden willingly messes up his pawn structure, but it was the only active plan for black to go for. Knight to d3, also very nicely played by Magnus, guards the b4 square. Now b4 is coming, you cannot stop that. Knight to e6, and now pawn to b4. Magnus agrees with the engine, it is the strongest move for white to play. A captures on b4, we have c captures on b4, and now pawn to f4. Looks like a pawn sacrifice, but it's not, as the bishop also guards the d4 pawn, and also this prevents the bishop from guarding the g5 pawn, which leads us to a very important question. Bishop captures on f4 was played, bishop captures, knight captures, and now which pawn would you capture? Would you capture the d4 pawn? Or would you capture the g5 pawn? Everything you know about chess is telling you to capture the d4 pawn. It's a central pawn, it creates a passed pawn. I mean, there's no reason not to capture the d4 pawn, except here there is, as it loses the game. Problem is, if you capture on d4, then you allow the king to come up the board. For example, king to g4, and now how do you continue? If you move the knight, the king can go to f5. If you don't want to do that, let's say you play knight to c2, you attack the b4 pawn, you play knight d3. Okay, you guard the b4 pawn, but now the knight also cannot move, because then you play knight to c5 and you pick up the b7 pawn. So what can you do? Of course, you can make a king move, but now king to f4, cutting off the black king from going any further. Also, the pawn covers this, and there really aren't all that many squares. If the king moves, then you gain even more space, king f5, king f6, and so on. If the knight moves, knight to c5 now comes with check, you'll pick up the b7 pawn. So it's one of those weird chess positions where the move you all wanted to play, unless some of you actually wanted to play knight captures on g5, then you have grandmaster level endgame understanding, which is of course what Jorden played. He played knight captures on g5 check, and that is the way to go. King to g4, and now knight to e4, challenging the f2 pawn. So knight to d3, defends the f2 pawn as well as the b4 pawn, and now knight to c3, attacking the a4 pawn, but Magnus just advances it, pawn to a5. And now to actually continue playing this as it is equal material, it's sort of an equal endgame, knight to e4 should be played. Now this kind of prevents the knight from moving, as the f2 pawn is hanging, so you have to advance, and then you move the knight, let's say with check, king f4, knight d7, and the game continues. White is always a little bit better, as white controls more space, but you can still fight. However, after knight to b5, he allows Magnus to go for knight to c5. And now, okay, he does win the d4 pawn, but he will lose the b7 pawn, which means that Magnus will have the passed a pawn, which also doesn't sound that bad. Now the problem is knight captures on d4, knight captures on b7, and knight to b5. It doesn't really look like there's a realistic chance of you advancing this pawn, because how are you crossing the a7 square? For the white knight to actually guard the a7 square, it would have to be on b5 or on c6, and that's impossible, or on c8. How are you getting it to c8? I mean, or c6. Doesn't really work. So okay, pawn to a6. Maybe you could play knight to a5 to c6, but now king to e6. Jorden plays correctly. He says there's no way to do this, but Magnus finds a way, and there is a way. He plays king to f4, and now we have knight to a7, just blockading the position and controlling everything. But the position is now completely winning for Magnus, but you have to figure out why. Feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning idea for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on being a true master of the endgame. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is knight to d8 with check. Of course, it's the first move you thought of, but it's the second move that counts in the variation. Here, of course, king to e7 was played. If you play king to d6, then knight captures here, then you pick up the h7 pawn and you just win with the h pawn. However, after king to e7, the move you had to find was knight captures on c6 with check, forcing the knight to be captured. This is what Magnus played. Jorden recaptured. Now Magnus plays pawn to b5, and the pawns are now unstoppable. Doesn't matter where you go to. If you go to a7, then you just advance the pawn, knight to c6, a7, and the pawn now becomes a queen. Or in the case of the game, knight to d4 was played. Now comes pawn to a7, and now knight to e6 with check. king to g3, preventing all further checks, and he was in this position on move 51 that Jorden van Foreest resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. The problem is, although you can play knight to c7 and guard the a8 square, b6 just kicks away the knight, and that's it. Knight to a8, b7, and that's it. You can queen pretty much whichever pawn you want, and that's it. You have you have many queens. You can even queen this pawn and this pawn and this pawn. It is possible. That's just how good your position is. So yeah, after king to g3, Jorden resigned, and that means they went into game 3 of the match, but that game ended in a draw, which meant, of course, that there is no way for Jorden to win the match. So he goes down a division, but it doesn't mean anything. He can still bounce back and win the tournament, as it's, that's the kind of tournament it is. So if you're interested in the other pairings, sorry, let me just fix this a little bit. I don't know why it's weird like that. So there you have it. Abdusattorov defeated Wesley So with 3-2. Aronian defeated Fedosev with 2.5 to 1.5. Caruana defeated Iturrizaga with 2.5 to half. And Magnus also defeated Jorden van Foreest with 2.5. So it will be in the semifinals Magnus Carlsen versus Fabiano Caruana and Levon Aronian versus Nodirbek Abdusattorov. And in the losers round, we will have Wesley So versus Fedosev and Iturrizaga versus Jorden van Foreest for a chance to bounce back into the main event. So yeah, very nicely done by Magnus after winning that grueling endgame with round 1. If you have a chance, do check it out. Like he really won an unwinnable game. He does it again in round 2. But he did just completely obliterate that Super United tournament in Croatia. And now he's definitely in the zone. He's still fully well prepared. So it was just Jorden who came first to the experience the full wrath of Magnus. So yeah, once again, really hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank James Eugene Cashman, Paul Miller, Brad Roth, Michael Marshall, and BulletChessThriller.com for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. And thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of pretty much everything that's happening in the chess world, and of course, my favorite, checking up your wonderful suggestions. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.